Hey everybody, Robot here from Vespa, Motorsport, and ScooterWest.com. So if you got an old GT200 or any Vespa, nice new 2024, you got a classic Vespa, we got the parts for you at ScooterWest.com. So right to the subject of this video. So here we have a beautiful Darling Plum GT200. Ironically, it's kind of the coolest color for the GT200. GT200 here in North America was from about 2004 to right about 2009. Kind of some of them lingered around even a little bit later. Its claim to fame is it's the first large frame Vespa. They do have a pretty smooth motor, has a 200cc motor that's kind of built on the architecture of the Vespa ET4, which they call the leader motor. It's a 150cc motor. So these motors, ironically, aren't the most robust motor. Once they came out with the GTS250, that motor was improved upon quite a bit, drastically. Of course, the biggest injection just gets better fuel economy, better operating at different elevations. It starts nice and easy. Don't have a carburetor clog. If you're looking to get one of these running, go look at my comprehensive carburetor cleaning video, specifically on a GT200. It's a very long video. I talk about everything you need to know about the carburetor that's on this specific model. Sometimes you got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them. Sometimes those carburetors, now that these scooters are coming on 20 years old, they're just in bad shape sometimes. Still can get a new replacement carburetor for this scooter. But there's a lot of parts you can't get, and I'll kind of ramble about a lot of the stuff you can and can't get for the scooter. So kind of listen along this how-to video slash podcast, kind of talking about the GT200 if you just want to listen to it. So today I'm going to specifically go over the rest of the fuel system other than the carburetor, because I've covered that in the past. And we get a lot of calls here at Scooter West about this. So for years, we've sold these two items. They're a factory fuel filter with the fuel line that goes from the fuel pump. They do have a vacuum operated fuel pump. I'll get all into that, to the carburetor. And they have clips on them ready to go, kind of just do it yourself, ready to install. Really easy to find on Scooter West web store. Just search for GT200 fuel line and you'll see this whole assembly. Good way to get it because it's already pre-cut with the correct kind of line, whether it's like Continental standard fuel line or this kind of Tygon fuel line that's really high quality from K&L or Honda that lasts quite a long time. Some of the other parts, if you're just looking for the original equipment fuel filter, we do have that fuel filter dash quarter. It's actually a pretty cool fuel filter. It does both 5/16 and quarter, or 6mm to 8mm hose. And it fits in a little rubber socket that holds the fuel filter in place. And a lot of people ask to replace fuel filters, and technically there's two fuel filters on a GT200. This is the vacuum operated petcock or fuel valve. This frequently does fail. It either starts leaking fuel or the scooter severely floods, and it might be this. It's either allowing fuel to bypass. It's supposed to shut the fuel off when the engine stops, when the vacuum signal to this port on the outside is no longer present, or the diaphragm in here fails and just starts completely flooding the scooter. I've seen GT200s where you take the oil dipstick out and you got an eruption of fuel, and it may be this valve right here. Real inexpensive. We sell hundreds of these every year because they fit a lot of other models, 575, 321. There's a specific part that's for the two-stroke models, but we're not talking about a two-stroke scooter today. Another item that fails as part of the fuel system is there's a mechanical, or actually a vacuum operated fuel pump. It's got 3 ports on it. It uses the pulses from the engine. So when an engine's operating, there's like a vacuum pulse that's through the intake, and it uses that pulse to operate on a diaphragm that's in here, and there's 2 one-way valves, and it makes the necessary fuel pressure for the carburetor to work right. So only on the GT200s that they have a fuel pump like this. I think it was used on a BV200 too, which is pretty similar motor platform to this thing here. Another item that starts to fail as they get old is the intake manifold. It's an all rubber intake manifold. It may not be cracked on the outside. Of course, I'll take it out, but it relies on kind of this rubber built-in gasket to seal up against the head. If you can never get the idle correct, even though you have a brand new carburetor or perfectly clean setup carburetor, it's probably your intake manifold. So I'm going to show how to change all these parts, and you'll see how they're all situated on the scooter. So as with pretty much any modern Vespa, open the seat, you get the pet carriers, people like to call it, or the underseat bucket. And you pull that out, and you have pretty easy access to much of the engine components. All right, so first of all, this thing's pretty dirty. Probably should have pressure washed it, but I'll glove up. And you can kind of see kind of the medium level of a rat's nest of hoses under here, and that's kind of the way these operate. You go to a fuel injection one, and you get more wiring, but less hoses. So some people do like these. You know, they're kind of the last of the Mohican for the last of a breed of a scooter where you could kind of work on it yourself, nearly every aspect of it. If you need to diagnose advanced fuel injection problems, you typically need dealer tools and some much more knowledge than what you need for fixing on a basic carburetor. So is what we're going to do today. You have a couple things. You got the intake manifold, I'll point that out right here, and it's hard as a rock. Probably the carburetor does flex a little bit. Sometimes they'll develop cracks out here. A lot of times the way I'll test for a air leak, I don't think this one actually has a leak, is I'll have the scooter running, and if it's got kind of a poor quality idle, I'll spray something, you know, usually carburetor cleaner, just a small burst around the intake manifold. And if you hear a change in idle, it's very likely you have a leaky intake manifold. Especially on high miles, or if they're in dry climates, it will dry out the rubber and it won't seal to the head anymore. There's a couple of hoses that I'll talk about. This is the evap hose, and it's probably getting pretty hard, as with all the hoses. There's another hose here that's just broken off. It's just crumbling. That originally went to a vent line on the side of the carburetor. There's actually a vent port. You could hook it back up. I mean, technically you need that hooked up for it to be emissions compliant, because it captures the vapors from the carburetor float bowl. But in my experience, if that line is hooked up, sometimes the scooter's more prone to flood, kind of the opposite of what it's supposed to do, you know, capture vapors, but you end up with more fuel outside and everywhere. So oftentimes I just leave that one disconnected. There is a carbon canister. It's located on the left side cowl, and I'll kind of show that. I do see some of the hoses are completely deteriorated on there, and you end up with vacuum leaks with some of this system. Technically, you got to leave this all in here if you want it to be emissions compliant. The nice thing about leaving most of it intact is if you park this in a garage, you're not going to end up with like a gas vapor smells. You have stuff that doesn't have the evaporative emissions control system. It just smells like gas in your garage all the time, and you wonder why, and it's because of that system, and half the hoses are all broken. That also causes air leaks. There's a hose right here, and you can kind of see it goes underneath the carburetor. It goes to this little diaphragm right here. This is referred to as an air injection system. And the way this works is, again, I think it has a pulse or a vacuum signal from the intake, and opens up a valve to a one-way reed valve, and it introduces a small amount of air into the exhaust stream, and that allows for unburnt gas to get burnt into in the muffler. The later fuel injection ones is all taken care of because they have much more accurate fuel control, so there's much less unburnt fuel going out. Hence why the fuel injected scooters get usually better fuel economy as well. Might as well just leave that in place, because if you do disconnect it, you'll end up with even more backfires on deacceleration. A lot of people are concerned about those little backfires on a GT200. It's pretty normal, especially when this system transitions from on and off with the vacuum signal. It makes a little pop backfire. Then you have another vacuum line off this port right here, and it comes all the way around here. It goes into a T somewhere under here. One goes to the fuel pump, the larger one, and then the smaller line goes to the actual vacuum operated fuel valve. And I'll pull all this all out, but some of these lines, they're probably on their last legs. Some of them are in really good shape, like this one. Even the fuel line's not that bad, but we'll just replace it. It's got the original clamps, you know, the OEM clamps on there. And then we're gonna go ahead and pull this right side cover off and you'll be able to see the fuel pump. But before I go any further, I'm gonna change the fuel valve. I'm gonna go ahead and siphon most of the gas out. You just pull the cap off. So, one of the easier ways to get the fuel out of the tank of a Vespa is one of these jiggle siphons. You can use it 2 different ways, or you can just use a hose. Probably don't want to be, you know, like the old movies, sucking on the end, get a mouthful of gas. Probably not the healthiest thing. You need a gas jerry can. So the way these work is you put that jiggle valve, it's got like a one-way like little ball valve that jiggles, and you get as far as you can into the tank and just give it a couple shakes, and then you'll get a siphon going. And if the tank's pretty low, I'll sometimes use a rag and compressed air and put some pressure on the tank, and that will start a siphon. That's another way to do it. And we're not gonna get all the gas out, but get most of it out and just allow it to siphon out as long as that jiggle valve is kind of at the lowest point of the tank, or the lowest I could push the valve. There you go, so that's about it. So we got most of it out, so we won't have too egregious of a fuel mess when we change out that fuel valve or the petcock. Good. Another reason you may want to siphon out is just old gas. In the States has a lot of ethanol in it, and if it's a year old, I would just change it, especially on one of these carbureted scooters. They kind of like to have good gas, especially the non-ethanol gas will even be better, but that's kind of hard to find, especially in California. All right, so we're gonna get this right side skirt, as I like to call them, off. The super rare part. Can't really get replacements for a lot of these parts. Can't get a taillight for this scooter, actually. The only way would be to replace all the rear body parts, with the exception of the frame, with the GT200 parts. So kind of keep that in mind with these scooters. They're kind of getting mechanically and definitely cosmetically obsolete. And I can tell it's got the wrong screws. It looks like some nice tech screws. I'll put the correct screws in there when I reassemble it. That's what happens when you get some shade tree. I think this one was worked on. You see the glued on reflector right there. So of course I'm struggling with this incorrect screw in here. Let's get that screw out of there. It shouldn't be that screw, but you know, at least it's better than a drywall screw. So you kind of pull from the back, and then you get that out of these rubber things. So I can tell somebody's already done some work under here. Here's your vacuum petcock that's in the tank. Ironically, when these leak externally, they leak right onto the hot exhaust. It's a pretty cool design. It makes some real hot, steamy gasoline vapors. I've never seen one burn down from it, but just FYI. This is your water pump. We're not really messing with that today. I think I've covered the water pump in the past. If you're do-it-yourselfer, the best bet on a GT200 is just to buy the whole entire cover with a complete water pump, because they have updated the design. This is actually the updated design, but if you have like a gray painted cover, it's going to be the older and more obsolete water pump design with smaller bearings and a smaller seal. They went to a better seal on these later ones that have that cast kind of finish. So somebody's replaced this line here. The vacuum line, it looks pretty good. It's actually pretty nice, but I'm gonna change all these parts because they look original. I could see kind of like gasoline leakage on them. And a lot of times it's just even the O-ring in here, but we do sell the O-ring for this, but oftentimes just replace the whole entire fuel petcock and it's easy enough. Here's your fuel pump right here. So you need a large Phillips screwdriver. Pull these 2 screws out. And this one is kind of buried back here. Obviously make sure everything's cool. I got most of the gas out, if you skip past that step. Pull the 2 screws out. Now everything kind of hangs, and you can see even the fuel filter right here is kind of hanging. Somebody put some worm gear hose clamps, nothing really wrong with those. Maybe we'll reuse them. And loosen up this. I want to see if the fuel valve is leaking. It did start okay. This scooter's not here specifically for this, but I thought this is a good candidate because it still has a lot of these systems that are original. And anything that touches fuel kind of only has a limited life. So I know there's still some fuel in the tank, but I think we're probably okay. I'm going to show you how to change the fuel valve. So you're going to have a little bit of a leakage. So I'll set one of these like pig mats down. These kind of are absorbent mats that kind of contain everything. First thing I'm going to do is replace this part. So 575321 is a part number. These are Italian made part. Well, we usually stock both original Piaggio ones, sometimes this. They're both made by the same manufacturer. You see, that's the first fuel filter. It actually does unthread, and there's an O-ring right here. You do want to get the angle pretty close, and you could turn it after the fact. So you want to have a tray ready, like something like this is like an oil pan tray, because the gas is just going to come gushing out. No matter how hard you try to siphon it all out, it doesn't all come out. And oftentimes as a tech, you want to get these jobs done quick, so you just deal with some of the leakage. Even touching this fuel tap, I could see it starting to leak. So I went ahead and loosened that clamp. I kind of hiked it up. It still has enough friction where it's going to stay in place because I don't really want it falling out. The cool thing about pulling this with fuel is if there's any sediment in the bottom of the tank, this is the opportunity it's going to flush it out. So we're going to go ahead and pull it, kind of rock it back and forth. It's in a plastic tank. These plastic tanks are generally pretty good. So you can see it's kind of dumping out, and you could get right in there and just pop the new one in. And since it's got the O-ring on there, it usually will seal right up. So just like that, a little bit went on the muffler. I'm not too concerned with it. And we could mess with the angle a little bit. You know, you might want to kind of mock things up. We're pretty close. I'm going to go one more click that way. Move that hose clamp down. Get our Phillips, or you can actually get a 7mm on there too, I think. Go ahead and tighten that up. And if you have a Vespa LX that's from, or an ET4 from 2001 to 2005, or a Vespa LX from 2006 all the way to about 2008, even some of the 2009, they're going to use this exact same valve. They just don't have the fuel pump. That's the only difference. So this spigot goes straight to the carburetor. So pretty much kind of showed you how to do it on some of the other carbureted models. Same with many of the Piaggio models. The very last years of the LX, they were either fuel injection or they had an electronic fuel pump. So very different. One thing I do see wrong with this line is there's like a little kink in there, and that could cause like a flow issue. A lot of people don't do that right, but we'll size that correctly. The original fuel pump is made by Mikuni. It's a pretty decent quality pump. This is the fuel outlet right here. So you got the fuel outlet right here, and there's even little arrows on the back that kind of indicate the direction of how these lines all go. So the way this works is you could just pry these tabs of these original one-time use hose clamps. They are pretty good hose clamps, but that's the original hose clamp to this fuel line because it's never been replaced. And then you could just usually use this to lever it right off. This fuel pump's probably still good. I don't think there's any issues with it, so I'm going to reuse it. Of course, you're going to have a little leakage on all these different parts. And this softer line that usually is still in good shape, that's actually your vacuum signal right there. So that hose clamp you can reuse. Actually, diagonals work pretty good for those clips like such. But we just want to get it all out of the way, kind of show you all these parts. And of course, be careful. You got still got some gas leakage, at least not leaking from the tank here. And there's your fuel pump right there. So the new one, oftentimes they're a different supplier. This is an Italian-made one, but all the ports are in the exact same spot. It's got that little centered metal filter right there for the air to go into it. And pretty much all the same ports. You just got to remember the intake This is the fuel outlet, and that's your vacuum signal on the bottom. So, but we're gonna reuse this one. This is the original Mikuni. This scooter has fairly low miles, and if I saw gas leaking out of this or out of that vent, it's definitely time to replace it. Or if it's just not pumping. I should have showed how that works. Say if you have a fuel starvation issue at speed, I would have left all this hooked up, but would have taken a hose off this and then put a hose into a little cup while the scooter's running, because there's still fuel in the carburetor, and I would watch how much it is pumping out, even when you give it some gas. Oftentimes, the more throttle you have is when these stop pumping. So if you're losing power at high speed, it may be the fuel pump. That's a typical syndrome of a failed fuel pump. They don't pump enough at higher volume. So underneath here, we got a couple items. You got the fuel filter right here. It's in this little rubber sling. That's actually the original fuel filter. Now, they do have this little protective sheath on here. You can reuse this. It kind of keeps everything in place. But we're going to replace the line, so get that out of the way, the little hose clip. You can pull that sheath off. You want to make sure all this stuff is pretty clean before we reassemble it, because the last thing you don't really want is some of this dirt getting in your fresh brand new fuel line. And typically when I set up a whole brand new fuel line, I'll run the scooter and allow some fuel to get pumped through the system, because you might have little shards of a fuel line, and it's not uncommon to all of a sudden you have a stuck float needle or a clogged jet after you replace all this stuff, because you end up sending debris into the carburetor. So it's best to flush all this stuff and kind of do a test. Now we'll do that because I know the scooter will start, there's still fuel in the carburetor bowl. So this little thing comes off, this little sling right here. I don't think there's really a replacement part for this rubber. If it's broken, you could just put a like probably not a rubber band, but like a zip tie around the fuel filters. Kind of got that round body. Another thing you want to keep in mind is all these things here. This still looks really, really good condition. We do sell the T's that have the kind of larger hose and the smaller one. This one has got a metered jet on it, the style we have. This is for the Vespa LX, so you could actually pull that little jet out. So you need to have the port that goes to the vacuum signal right here. And then this one goes to the fuel pump. Still looks to be in good shape. I'm gonna leave it alone. This is all, I think, 6mm hose. We do have that available, like a decent quality stuff. This I'm going to replace with a little piece of 6mm hose, but a little bit shorter, so you don't end up with that kink in there. All right, so we're going to go ahead and just loosen the carburetor. The clamps, this is your air intake boot. This thing is usually getting pretty hard at this age, but still usable. If you have to push these back on and you're having trouble, you can always take it off and put it in hot boiling water. Plus you can clean it, which I should be doing, but you should have all this stuff clean when you're touching it, but I'm not going to do that today. So oftentimes you want to lever the carburetor out of the intake manifold. Kind of just pulls on. I'm going to leave it on that one because it's going to be on there pretty tight. And the carburetor is running fine, actually. There's no reason. Somebody must have used this bike over its whole life, because if it sat for a year, it would have needed a carburetor cleaning. It doesn't really have that much evidence of that. So there's this clamp right here. It's already kind of loose. That's the original clamp. Most of the time it's been replaced with something else, like a worm drive clamp. And we'll get the diagonal pliers, kind of cut it out of the way. Sometimes you could just kind of carefully lever it off. Got it out of the way. And then you have the fuel line and this vacuum line go through this sheath right here. Kind of wipe that all down. And we go ahead and pull the fuel filter out. So just like that, I'm going to pull the whole fuel. This is the old fuel filter. It's not too bad a condition, but lines are still supple. But you can see there's like cracking on the ends. So just best to replace all these parts. So the brand new fuel filter with the correct length lines, they're 1/4 inch or 6.4 millimeters. We do have these pre-installed little clamps on there. If you want to pull the one off, if you have an old set of needle nose, you could kind of make a little slot, and that's how you could get these clamps off. You kind of just lever them off. Don't squeeze them too much. They work really good. They kind of need a specific tool. One thing to keep in mind as we're pushing this through the sheathing, it might catch some dirt, and that's why we're going to want to run the engine after this. So I'm going to go ahead and push that fuel line all the way up through that sheathing. I mean, you can get away without the sheathing, but since it's still here, might as well leave it in place. And you may need to kind of help it along, especially in this area where that grommet is. That grommet kind of keeps it from rubbing on the rear fender. Kind of funny how they did that stuff. And if you're having trouble pushing it through, you can actually cut the zap strap or the zip tie off that little grommet. We'll reinstall it when we're all finished up. And if you're still having difficulty, you can always spray everything with some silicone spray. Getting it through, there we go. Kind of pull everything, so. And we're not gonna hook up the fuel line just yet because there's still some fuel in the bowl of the carburetor. So, and I'll run it just for a moment to capture some of that fuel. So now we're gonna go back to the left side of the scooter. All right. So we have the new fuel filter right through here. One other thing I'm gonna replace. This hose is still in really good shape. I kind of looked at it, there's no cracks. If you have any cracking in there, you could have an air leak. Again, you could replace that with 6mm hose, preferably something like this Tygon hose, a little thinner wall than the fuel line. This would be a direct replacement, so you could find that as bulk hose at the Scooter West web store. This is really high quality stuff. I had to use a slightly cheaper standard GT fuel line assembly, but it's comparable to what the original was, so no issues there. But I do want to replace this little line. I can see some cracking. This has been replaced in the past, and you got to be careful. These T's are pretty easy to break. A lot of times the easiest way to get a line off is just cut through the hose all the way to the barb, and then you don't have to pull on that fragile barb to get the hose. And it's just a standard T, but you can see it's got like the two 6mm fittings and then one 4mm fitting. It's about 1/8 inch. So it does have this nice little clip. Again, you could use that. And it's always nice if you have the original. So I got some of that correct kind of vacuum line. A lot of times that's referred to as vacuum line on old cars where they had carbureted systems. And we'll go ahead and cut that. Put that little clip back on there. So that's going to be useful here. And put that right back on the barb. It fits pretty nice all the way on there, and then we'll push this little clip on there. Now we have a nice fresh line on there, nice and tight. So this little bracket right here is what holds that fuel filter. So we'll go ahead and, it's got the original style fuel filter, slide that little rubber bit right on there. And you kind of want to just kind of do a little test fit. The next important line that we need to do is this short line. And I'm going to cut it a little bit shorter than this. I would say that's about 35mm long, 36mm, so 1.5 inches, maybe a little bit less. So I'm going to go ahead and get some 3/16 or 4.5mm hose, preferably really flexible stuff like this Tygon hose, similar to what's found on that fuel filter. We're just going to cut a little length of it. And you can see it kind of pushes on the barb. We're going to do a little test fit. I'm going to push that all the way on and kind of line up my fuel pump and see, it looks like I got a cut. I want to push it right to the end. The old fuel line wasn't pushed all the way on. but it looks like I need to cut maybe 3/16, a little more than 3 millimeters off it. So it's pretty good. This line is so good, you can actually get away without using a clamp. Oftentimes when you have a fuel leak right here, it's this little hose that leaks. These are a little bit overkill. I might save them for another part. Like you could even use them on the other things. Preferably you want to have little clips like this if you do want to use hose clamps. But the thing is, this is pretty stabilized because it's kind of a very short line. There's nothing really pulling on it. And so oftentimes you don't even need to put a hose clamp on it, especially if you're using really good quality hose like this Tygon hose. So we'll go ahead and push that on there. And you want to get it pushed onto the barb as far as you can. It's almost there, so. And now see how it all lines up really good and there's no kink, and it's just a short little line right there. The next step is we're going to start getting these screws back in place. I've seen so many like different jerry rigs with this little setup, but if you just get it all right, then it will, you know, give you another 10 years, 15 years of life, no problem. So get that started right here. Get that one started, and I have the bracket, of course, for that fuel filter up in there. And if needed, you could loosen this clamp if you had to rotate the petcock a little bit, get it in a good angle. But we're perfect. That hose has no kink in it. It's exactly where I want it. And I have that vacuum tee is kind of right next to where the fuel filter is. And I have the feed line, or the line that comes out of the fuel pump right here. So the next steps, you could replace these little wire clamps with one of these worm gear clamps if you want. These will work just fine. So push that right onto the barb. And just to show you the proper tool, this is like the snap-on hose clip pliers. This is specifically for them, but you can always improvise like I showed you earlier steps. Go ahead and slide that on. Kind of want to have it facing down. And then the last line is our vacuum line to the fuel pump. Another thing you could do, see how it's just a little bit swollen at the end? Oftentimes this line is still in really good shape, like I said, so you just cut a little end off it and you could reuse it. I think this line's still got a lot of life in it, so I'm not going to replace it, but maybe it's a good idea. Maybe you got a really dry rotted scooter with tons of miles on it. Maybe replace every single rubber hose. Wouldn't be a bad idea. It's just you need to size different hoses. Pretty critical on getting the size. And again, sometimes these clips, it was easier to use a diagonal to get them on. It's pretty important you have all these on here, because if one of these pops off, you either end up with a fuel leak or you end up with a motor that's going to stall. So the last line we have is this little vacuum line for the vacuum signal to the petcock. So I got another little clip on here. In a pinch, you could use a cable strap or a zip tie to do that, but everything's all set up there. I'm gonna leave it off because I do want to start the scooter and make sure there's no leaks. You could have put this little sheathing on there as well. Kind of forgot that, but it's not the most critical thing. So you could keep these lines kind of together. You gotta be careful not to overdo a zip tie on hoses because you can collapse them. But I just put one kind of loose. It keeps them kind of stabilized and together, much like how this little thing. This thing's a little bit on the hard side anyways, but it could have been reused. Same with other little spots. If you wanted to just tidy it up a little bit, you could put another little zip tie on there. But for instance, if you didn't have that clip, you could put a small zip tie right there. And you know, those aren't the most readily available clips. And if you put that on there, it's going to hold that in place. And you know, zip ties, you know, they're made out of nylon. They do last quite a long time. So it's another way to do that. But everything should be sealed. We'll go ahead and fill the tank back up with fuel, and we're going to do a little test. All right, getting the gas back in there. Got one of those old school gas cans. Still leaks, look at that. Not the best situation. All right, so we got most of that gas back in there. Some of it leaked out. It's not going to really hurt the paint. You want to have a nice clean rag or something if you are going to wipe it off the painted body parts. It does stain stuff after if it sits on there, but if you let it evaporate or wipe it off, it's not going to hurt anything. So I told you I'd want to prime the line. I don't even have it hooked up to the carburetor, but I know the carburetor has got enough fuel. I'm actually, just for show and tell, I'm going to go ahead and start it, and I'll show you this line get filled up with gas, just to kind of give you an idea of how a good fuel pump works. So that's connected to the fuel line that's supposed to go to the carburetor. I'm going to go ahead and push the carburetor all the way in to the manifold, and we're going to go ahead and start the scooter and watch that line fill up. So. So, just to show you, it's going to start filling up the hose. This is a good thing that I'm getting it flushed out. So, any of the hose, you know, the line. So, that's about how much fuel flow is coming out of this little fuel pump. It's not much. It's just a trickle. So, the flow changes a little bit when you run it. And when I turn the ignition off, it should eventually slow down and come to a complete stop. So that's a good indication everything's working correctly on the fuel pump. And at this point, I've flushed enough fuel through this, and I'll kind of try to drain this out, and we'll hook the carburetor back up with the fuel line. So there's enough fuel in that carburetor to run the motor. What did I run it for? About 15, 20 seconds. So I'll just go ahead and use this little wire clamp that's included with the fuel line, but you could certainly use one of those worm gear clamps on this hose. It's kind of a larger size in diameter. And we'll just push it on the barb of the fuel pump, or the carburetor, excuse me. And it's all the way on there. And the last thing you want to put on is this little rubber thing. Pretty self-explanatory. Put some zip ties in there. It's just, the idea is the motor goes up and down, and you don't really want that fuel line rubbing on through the rear fender. So that's why they have this little thing. So we'll put that back in place. All right. So now that we know the fuel pump's working, the fuel valve is working perfect, and it's got a fresh new filter, and we primed it, everything hooked up. Let's just start it. And you kind of just want to look, make sure there's no leakage anywhere, wiggle everything, and I think we're pretty good. So we're going to move on to the left side of the scooter and work on those hoses on the evaporative emission system next. So just like the right side, get the pair of screws out. Ironically, these are the easiest side skirts to get off. And as every year that's come out, they've gotten more difficult to get off. The 2023s and 2024s are by far the most difficult to get off. But you have very clean lines where there's no seams, no exposed fasteners. So at the expense of beauty, a little bit less serviceable, you know, for something like this. But these old ones, they didn't care about the exposed fasteners back in the day, so they made it nice and easy to access. So right here is a one-way, or it's not a one-way valve, it's like a metering valve, and you can see the hose is just straight broken. And it goes on the very bottom of this canister. And the other side doesn't even have a hose clamp. I could pull the little remnant of crumbling hose right off it, no problem there. So we're gonna go ahead and fix this little line right here. Get our diagonals off, cut that original clamp. This Gates line, US made Gates line that came with the scooter, actually is still in good shape, so I'm not going to mess with that. But whatever this stuff is, this Italian rubber line is completely deteriorated. So get that out of the way. And again, you could kind of use the diagonal pliers to push these off, kind of from the barb, or it's crumbling, so just chunk it off. This isn't too critical because it's just airflow and vacuum going through these, so we're not worried about getting debris in there. So I went ahead and cut just a small length of 5/16 fuel line or hose, and you just want to push it over to barb. You could get away without using a hose clamp, possibly on it's not too critical, but you know, you do end up with a little air leak. But I do suggest just put regular hose clamps on there, nice and easy to use. So I got kind of being resourceful. If you're looking for these on the Scooter West web store, they're HCL4. It's a number 4 hose clamp. SAE number 4 hose clamp is what these are. And you just kind of slide them over and you just tighten the little worm gear like this. Pretty simple to use. Reusable, that's the cool thing about them. So, and don't need to tighten it too much. And of course you're not going to see what I'm doing, but there's 2 ports on the bottom of this carbon canister, this evaporative emissions canister. So the front one's got a pretty good hose still. It's got that Gates line. The rear one is where this little one, so the one that's about right here. And we'll have the hose clamp all ready to go. And I'm going to use a little short stubby screwdriver. You're not going to really see what I'm doing, but you get the idea. So push it up on there, make sure it doesn't kink. And we'll go ahead and tighten that hose clamp, and I can kind of see right up in here. You can even get away with a nice long screwdriver. My head's probably in the way of the camera, but you get the idea. So just like that, and we'll go ahead and tighten that clamp there. Or you could get your hand up in there with a little stubby screwdriver. So that's probably the easiest way to do that. To do it yourself or even a seasoned technician, just go in there and replace that hose. I've covered that hose on the GT200 because those have all rotted out as well. Perfect time to check your air filter. You'll see a lot of times on this age of scooters, not only are the rubber parts deteriorating, and that includes the dry belt. It may have low miles, but don't be surprised if you have a low miles older scooter and the dry belt breaks. Well, the rubber usually deteriorates. So this is a later GT200. It's got this little scoop, and actually this is still in good shape, but usually these are all deteriorated, and we have them available. This is not a very critical one because it's for the belt cover, but you could replace it if needed. You don't put oil on it, but the air filter is much more important for the engine. And we sell the premium original Piaggio air filters that come pre-oiled. Those are the easiest to use for a do-it-yourselfer, but we also have less expensive options, Malossi options, and more. Take all the screws off that. I've covered that in several past videos, how to service the air filter. But just a little thing to check while you're doing all this work. Certainly my techs would do that, or I'd do that if I'm fixing a fuel system. Next, we're gonna go back underneath the seat. And once we know everything's done, we'll just put the side skirts on. I'm not gonna show that, but I got little chunks of fuel line all around here, so get rid of that. All right, so now we're gonna do the last part of this whole super comprehensive fuel system service minus the carb, which I've covered in the past. So the intake manifold, again, it's a rubber bit. It starts developing leaks. 842734 is the OEM part number. It's been superseded by Piaggio for the European version. So there's a slightly different arrangement on the ports, and we'll get to that. But you need the intake manifold. A couple other parts. If you order on the Scooter West web store, I have a nice write-up on what else you need to successfully install this. So you kind of want to clean up all around there. Something like brake parts cleaner. Make sure engine's not too hot because this is flammable. But just to get all that dirt so I don't put more dirt into the engine. So we still have this clamp loose. Go ahead and loosen this clamp, which I kind of left loose. And you kind of want to loosen it almost all the way. You know, it's still staying intact, but at this point, that intake manifold is probably pretty hard. There is some lines still connected to it. We have a couple other hoses that we got to deal with. Got this kind of long one here. That's the vacuum for the fuel tap. So go ahead and pull this up. This hose was still in good shape, so we didn't bother replacing it. Let's disconnect that. And again, the end's kind of looking a little shabby, so there's a lot more extra line than we need, so go ahead and trim that a little shorter. And then we have the line that goes to, this is the breather line for the emissions canister, the evaporative emissions canister. So go ahead and cut this clamp. A couple ways you can go about it. You could have really sharp diagonals, not like these ones. You can actually cut the clamp. And sometimes you could just get brute with it and rip it apart like that. Not really the best thing. Or you could pop the little tab like what I've done in the past when I have access to it. And kind of when you get underneath it, you could just oftentimes pop it off. So, yeah, it's probably even at this point loose enough. And again, I'll probably just cut the end of this hose off because it's probably a little haggard. Another thing that happens on these intake manifolds, sometimes these brass fittings actually pull out. And at that point, you just want to replace it. Could glue it back in, but they're not that expensive for a replacement manifold, so. We'll struggle with this here, robot. There we go. So get that out of there. We're not reusing that. And this hose, usually this is on there pretty tight. So if you lever a hose off, that's how you get it off the easiest versus pulling it. They're like kind of like a Chinese finger trap. They got this extra sheathing on here. We're gonna actually pull this off and we're gonna get rid of that other hose that originally went to the breather port on the carburetor. I could still see a remnant of it actually right here. Little breather port right here. You could hook it back up, but this line usually is all rotted and it's not needed. So there's a chunk of that hose that still remains. We'll get rid of that. And the last one is the little vacuum port for that air injection valve. So kind of pull the clamp off. This one's a little bit smaller line. Again, this hose is still in good shape, but might as well trim it so you have a nice fresh end to go onto the barb. So the carburetor's away. There's just going to be 3 bolts. And I usually like to use a T-handle to pull the intake manifold off. If you are going to reuse one of these, you could put silicone sealant to kind of seal it up against the head, but I kind of pull it out, I'll show you how dried up it will be. And this, oftentimes, they may not just have an air leak from a crack in the rubber that's visible, but there's an air leak underneath the intake manifold. So that's the most common spot for them to leak because they don't use a gasket. The Vespa LX ET4, they actually had a gasket. The fuel injected ones are sometimes built like this. The much newer fuel injected ones are even better. They went to an all aluminum manifold, intake manifold. So kind of, you hear about stuff going more plasticky. In some cases, they've improved on the designs. So you got this coolant line kind of in the way and this wire, but we'll just carefully lift this out of the way. Make sure you don't drop anything down the intake of the scooter. But you can see this thing is like a rock under here. And you want to separate this hose clamp right here. It's not the worst one I've seen. Not really any all the way crack throughs, but and at this point we're going to kind of clean that intake manifold surface. You could just give it a careful spray, and we're kind of probably adding a little bit more fuel into the intake charge. You may want to shove a rag in there so you don't drop anything down into the valves, because that would be detrimental to the engine once it's all clean. So just carefully put one of these like blue reusable towels. And since you got hoses all over here, you want to make sure nothing else gets pinched. All right, so we got the new Piaggio intake manifold, and I'll show you what's different. Again, you can go on the Scooter West web store for the part number, and you'll see the write-up on how to set these up. So you have the intake manifold. This is much softer. This port's identical, and it's kind of drilled out to a specific size. But you can see there's 2 ports on this larger one. So the way around that is you could put a T or maybe you don't have the evaporative emission system anymore. I'm not going to talk about that, but this hose just goes directly to the vacuum operated fuel pump in the fuel tap if you don't have the rest of the emissions system on the scooter. So that's kind of how it works, just to show you the difference. See how flat the bottom is, while this has the molded in rubber gasket, so it will seal up perfect. So these kind of flatten out over time, and that's what causes issues. If you're a big nerd, you could go in there and grind those flat and smooth this all out and port it and get about 1.5% more power. Probably that's all you maybe ever see on a dyno, but there's some room there for you hot rod heads. So this is our hose for the evaporative emissions. Again, the end's kind of in bad shape. We're gonna go and trim that. I'm gonna get the sheathing off because we don't care about the two hoses. I only want the one hose on there. The other hose is completely rotted. There we go. You can see the chunks of the old hose falling out. The blue hose just kind of completely rotted. But you see that nice Gates fuel line still in really good shape. They actually use it as a vacuum line. Again, we'll go ahead and trim this. We're going to trim it quite a bit shorter because you could even use that hose for our little T, but I'm going to trim it about that short. So now it's a nice fresh end on it. And if you're wondering where that blue hose goes, there's like a T up underneath here that you can, goes to the fuel tank. And on that T, you can go ahead and plug that hose, you know, that blue hose that's completely rotted off. It's not needed, just goes to the carburetor bowl. More of a nuisance than anything. The way I like starting with this is we'll start by putting the intake manifold on. So there's our hose clamp, kind of have it facing up, that for the actual clamp of the carburetor. Pretty important that you don't pinch any of the hoses or this wire or anything. Kind of got to pull the carburetor back. Of course, if the carburetor is not in place, job's even easier, but we're kind of doing this with everything in place. So, all right, so we'll kind of get the first one lined up. Just want to get everything started. And these T-handles sometimes can be your friend for this kind of job because you kind of steer the fastener around versus a ratchet. You don't quite have that feel for that. Make sure you get it straight. Don't need any Loctite or anything on these. And we'll get all 3 of the fasteners in. Kind of gonna start pulling it down. There we go. And the last one. And that little wire right there is actually the temperature sensor for the temperature gauge that's on the dashboard. So there's also a temperature switch underneath the floorboard. That's what triggers the fan on these. So if you hear that cooling fan come on, they only come on when on very high temperatures, or say you're stopped idling for 5 minutes at a train stop or something like that. That's when the fan comes on, and it alarms a lot of customers. You know, I get people like, wow, it overheated, I heard something come on. I said, that's normal operation. You just happen to hear everything because you're on a scooter, not in a car where you're completely isolated from anything that's going on in a gasoline engine. All right, so kind of just go around. If you want to torque those with a torque wrench, about 7.5 foot-pounds. And at this point, we have that nice, fresh, brand new manifold. Carburetor is going to go in like magic. And if it doesn't go in easy, you could always put a little bit of silicone spray, but definitely always nice pushing the carburetor in with a brand new manifold because everything's soft and easy. And then we'll get this hose clamp. Of course, part of the hose clamp I can't see, so you gotta rotate it around. Do want to make sure it misses the throttle pulley, so I probably would have been better off having it on the other side, but it's fine right here as long as it's not interfering with the throttle pulley. And I can get easy access to it when I need to service it next time. So go ahead and tighten that. Don't need to tighten it so much that it squeezes the living snot out of the rubber. And I got that little rubber grommet right there. Fuel filter's in the right spot. And everything's tight here. It's got the vibration isolation of the rubber intake manifold. We'll start with the easy one. It's that hose that goes to the air injection valve. Oftentimes you just push it right onto the barb. And again, I trimmed that. And if you can't get it on there, you can always pull the hose clamp back a little bit. Just like that, push the hose on all the way onto the barb, and then push that back in place. So again, pretty important to have this, otherwise you end up with a lot of little backfires. That thing's disconnected. And then we have this big open port. So if you don't have that evaporative emissions, this hose just goes directly to that line. So, but we're gonna hook up that carbon canister again, because I just like not having to smell fuel. And got some wires here, we'll get those out of the way. So you need to get like a little barb like this. And a couple ways we can go about it. You could do it like this way. You could kind of do a longer hose and kind of route it around. On the illustration, I've kind of had a couple different ways I've set it up. So I push that on there, since that hose is still in really good shape. And we'll reuse that little clamp, but we got to make 2 more connections. So you have the hose that rests on top. And I got rid of that extra sheathing. And yeah, it's pretty good right there. Put a hose clamp on that. Just to kind of, right now I'm just mocking up, and then I'll need to do a little loop that goes onto that barb. So you want to use a hose that's not going to get collapsed, because it is a vacuum signal, and if it's a tight bend, if it kinks like that, you're going to lose fuel pressure. So I'm kind of just mocking it up. This is again that same kind of 1/4 inch hose, or 6 millimeter would be a close metric approximation. And it's got a nice sweep right there. I think we'll be good right there. So I'll cut it just about like that. And you know, with the heat over time, everything's going to take shape. But this is just a little mock-up to see how it all works. I think we'll be fine. Kind of is going to sit on top of the head, and it's making a nice sweep. And we have everything all connected right here. You could be lazy and just put zip ties as hose clamps, but I'll put some nice little wire clamps similar to this. So I want to share with you another type of hose clamp for small diameter hoses. And sometimes the worm gear clamps don't work so good with these smaller vacuum lines. These are called hose bands, and we have several different sizes. I'm going to size up the correct sizes for those hose. We have those available on the Scooter West web store. I think this one's 15-30 seconds, but also 7/16 might be even ideal. But I think this 15-30 seconds might be good for some of these lines right here. So we'll size that up. We kind of got it all dismantled again. And that one's a little loose. I know that one will be the correct size for the other one, so I'm going to go a 7/16. Downside of the hose bands, they need to be sized to the correct thing. And I'm using a diagonal. Just happens to work pretty good. Diagonal pliers, that is. But you could use like a needle nose or anything like that. There you go. So that's on there really tight. Then we'll use that next size up for the other barb. So yeah, I'll leave that wire kind of underneath. And right now, if you have trouble pushing these on, you can always spray some silicone spray, or even a little bit of dish soap will do the trick. So just massage it on there. And then I'll use that, kind of put that on there, and that's not going anywhere. And then the last hose, it's a little bit larger diameter, so I don't think that 15/16 is going to work. I'm probably going to use a 1/2 inch band. That seems like a good diameter for this. So, and plus we want that to be a little tight. This hose was a little bit on the loose side. Probably could get away with a worm gear clamp on this hose technically. So, but let's just Set that one up. Again, if you're having difficulty getting those on, you could always use dish soap. And if that doesn't, the diagonal doesn't work good, you could use something like a nail nose. Be careful with these because they will go flying across the room. If you release the tension, they do have a spring to them. So now that is really, really tight and it's not coming off. This hose just kind of always kind of sits down there. And you know, as the motor, when you sit on the suspension, the motor actually goes down, so there's more clearance right here. And if you're really concerned with it, you could certainly kind of do a zip tie somewhere. Just make sure everything has some movement and articulation from, you know, when it's moving. If you're really concerned, you could put another piece of sheath on here so it's not rubbing on that edge. But that pretty much kind of concludes everything you need to know about the fuel system on the GT200 specifically. It also all carries over to the LX and the Vespa ET4, many of the Piaggio scooters and such. So go ahead and start the scooter. I'm sure it's going to sound fine. That sounds pretty good. All right, well, thanks for watching and following along. I hope you learned something from everything I've done. Just something I never covered. These scooters have been around for a while. So again, if you're looking for any of those parts, find them on scooterwest.com. We always have them in stock, ready to ship same day to you. Or if you're in San Diego, stop by the store. We'll see you on the next one. Robot here from Vespa Motorsport and scooterwest.com. For all things Vespa, check us out on the web, Scooter West. Or if you're on YouTube, you want to see 900 or more or whatever, however many Vespa videos I made over all these years, just type Vespa Motorsport in YouTube and it will bring you to our homepage. And then there's another search where you can search for all my videos. And my suggestion is search by the model you have. Say you have a GT200, just type GT200 carburetor or something, and you'll get the comprehensive carburetor rebuild or any of the service videos, change the belt. And with Vespas, a lot of the services carry over. So if you watch the belt job on a GTS 250, it's very similar to this. This has kind of a combination of doing a belt service on an old Vespa ET4 LX and a GTS 250. So there's kind of some fall between. So if I don't have a specific video, watching a couple of them, you'll be an expert at doing many of these jobs. We'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.